Election season is ramping up in America, and boy oh boy is the rhetoric getting hot. And we're not just voting for a president, we're casting our ballot for the future of democracy, for the very concept of freedom, for the fight against fascism.
And the freedom that unlocks all the others the freedom to vote.
Now, some of this rhetoric is motivated by fears about Project 2025.
They want to not just stop the fixing of the problem, right? They want to revert back to the eras when we ignore the problem. And that's a lot of what's contained in Project 2025.
A legislative agenda which aims to resurrect a law from the 1800s, which would ban abortion and throw healthcare providers in jail, make pornography illegal. Oh, a bunch of sad little gooners out there if that happens. They also want to maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family.
Comstock is this law from 1873, a law by this notoriously prudish anti-vice crusader who kind of took pride on hounding people to their deaths in some cases and imprisoning people, burning books.
And then they also want to finish Trump's border wall complete with a military-style patrol.
His two major promises on immigration are to build a wall and to carry out the largest deportation operation in the history of the country.
Now, the plan argues that illegal immigration should be ended, not mitigated, the border sealed, not reprioritized.
We are going to close the border as a country.
This has a lot of Americans afraid that a second Trump presidency could lead to full-on fascism. Some of these fears were recently shared by our friends across the pond, with the UK's Conservative Party and France's National Rally Party offering similarly bleak policies, focused on deporting migrants and sealing off borders. But in a move that honestly might give some Americans hope, both the UK and France managed to avoid right-wing victories and a potential slide into fascism. In France, a left-wing coalition defeated the far right, led by Marine Le Pen, which has been hailed as a defeat of fascism at the ballot box. Similarly, a landslide victory for the UK's Labour Party has been described as a beacon of hope for progressives worldwide. With the specter of Trump linked to the growing threat of fascism in the United States,
it's not enough to call Trump and those promoting his ideas authoritarians, when what they are really advocating is something far worse. Fascism.
Many are hoping to replicate the apparent success in Europe by defeating Trump and, by proxy, fascism.
You deserve to know that the 2024 race will indeed come down to who's going to trip and fall and who's going to kill American democracy.
But even if fascism was defeated at the ballot box, it seems to have quickly returned to the streets. Okay, before we dive in, I want to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Private Internet Access. Private Internet Access is a VPN. If you don't know what that is, whenever you're browsing online, your device is transmitting tons of information that can be viewed by hackers or anyone else looking to make money off your data. Now, a VPN, a virtual private network, keeps your data secure while you're browsing. Think about it this way, you wouldn't go to the beach without sunscreen because you'd get burned. And in this case, having a VPN is like having SPF for your data. I'm a huge fan of VPNs, not just for safety, but because they're also fun. Now, I used to live in the UK and I still love a lot of TV shows there, but I can't watch them because the internet thinks I'm in America, which I am. But with Private Internet Access, I can tell the internet that I'm actually in England, so then I can watch my favorite British quiz shows. And Private Internet Access isn't just for your computer. You can use it on a ton of different devices and all platforms, including Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, and iOS. Plus, there's no limit on the number of devices. So with one subscription, you can protect your entire household. Best of all, Private Internet Access never records your data. They have a strict no logs policy, putting them head and shoulders above all other VPNs. Now, when you click the link in the description, you're gonna get Private Internet Access for 83% off the regular price, plus 4 extra months of protection free, which is just $2.03 a month, plus those 4 extra months for free. Stay safe when you're on the internet with Private Internet Access. Now, let's get back to the show. Streets. In the last few weeks, the UK has been rocked by a series of far-right riots. Sparked by a gruesome murder, far-right and fascist rioters blamed migrants and Muslims and attacked and set fire to a mosque. This was followed by days of violent street mobilization, including mobs invading and setting fire to a hotel housing migrant families. But while mobs have been heard chanting former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's "Stop the Boat" slogan, it was not just the right-wing political parties who played into this rhetoric. While the Labour Party has condemned the riots and set up a standing army of police, Labour itself veered far to the right on immigration during the election. It used the same small boats crisis in its manifesto to uphold national security, while the now Prime Minister Keir Starmer came under fire for singling out Britain's Bangladeshi community for targeted deportations. In the wake of the riots, Labour Party veteran Dame Margaret Hodge declared that we're too frightened to talk about immigration while advocating for tightening border controls. And this isn't a uniquely European phenomenon. Writing about the DNC for Vox, Christian Paz noted that the Democratic Party has swung far to the right on immigration policy.
Last year, Joe and I brought together Democrats and conservative Republicans to write the strongest border bill in decades. The Border Patrol endorsed it.
The convention even had a Border Patrol officer as a featured speaker.
Now, Kamala, on the other hand, has been fighting border crime for years.
And of course, for anyone who watched the final speech, presidential candidate Kamala Harris had this to say about immigration.
And let me be clear, after decades in law enforcement, I know the importance of safety and security, especially at our border.
Well, it can be tempting to view anti-immigrant venom as an exclusively far-right phenomenon.
It is a very sad thing for our country. It's poisoning the blood of our country.
The case in the UK might tell us something slightly different. Instead of an opposition between far-right and neoliberal approaches to immigration, there appears to be significant crossover. While the Labour Party and the Democrats condemn far-right racism, well, they still call for tightly controlled borders in the name of national security. So today, we're going to show how there's increasingly less daylight between far-right and liberal positions on immigration, and how this might make the threat of fascism more immediate than we like to admit. Now, anti-immigrant sentiments are nothing new in America. Under Obama, Central American families seeking asylum were detained in camps. Under Trump, this escalated into the infamous family separation policy, which resulted in migrant children being kept in cages under dire conditions. Sadly, this wasn't surprising due to Trump's campaign rhetoric.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
When you think about it, build that wall and stop the boats almost seem like transatlantic cousins. And despite some rolling back of Trump-era border policies, the number of people being detained in private migrant detention centers has surged during Biden's presidency. These are basically prisons where migrants fleeing persecution face the same grim conditions as convicted felons, including solitary confinement and torture. And thus far, Harris seems happy to continue these policies. Now, across the board, Democrats haven't hesitated to co-opt right-wing rhetoric in their bid to be seen as tough on immigration. And of course, this isn't exclusive to America. Anti-immigration policy has been a central pillar of far-right politics for over a century, with many high-profile far-right and neo-fascist movements in both America and Europe organizing around a rejection of globalization and the supposed floods of immigrants that it might bring. Immigrants, they say, threaten the very foundations of the state. British neo-fascist groups like the English Defence League and Britain First opposed the so-called Islamification and forced multiculturalism generated by mass migration, supposedly co-signed by liberal elites. Such groups view immigrants, and non-migrant Muslim folks for that matter, as a threat, imagining a perpetual standoff between the white civilized British and some barbarian other. For the far right, the sacred ideal of the nation is paramount, and threats to its national character demand an extreme, even violent response. But they're not alone in their scaremongering. The European Union, too, has for a long time purposely fostered a hostile environment for immigrants and asylum seekers, dubbed Fortress Europe. It's a collection of state and EU policies, including building physical walls along Europe's borders, making asylum crossings more difficult and dangerous, and funding the proliferation of migrant camps in places like Calais, France. Now, in the UK, a cartoonishly villainous plan by the Conservatives to fly asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing was delayed long enough by courts and, solidarity activists to be scrapped by the new Labour government. But the new administration's stance on immigration isn't that different. In the days following their victory, the Labour Party announced that it was repurposing the flights originally scheduled for the Rwanda scheme to return 46 failed asylum claimants to Vietnam and Timor-Leste. Meanwhile, Labour's manifesto includes things like launching a dedicated border force. Moreover, several undocumented food delivery drivers recently reported a massive police crackdown, which was confirmed to be the result of a direct order from the new Labour government. Sadly, it seems like the UK and the US share more than just a love of lagers and fried foods. There is currently a labor shortage hitting the US, with the manufacturing sector alone down roughly 1.4 million workers since the pandemic started. And both the US and Europe are experiencing labor shortages in agriculture. Now, some scholars have argued that the solution to these problems is opening borders and improving labor protections. But neoliberal policy wonks don't find such evidence-based policy compelling. Instead, across the mainstream political spectrum, hostility to immigration rages on. So why do parties with ostensibly diametrically opposed political views both treat immigration as an imminent threat to the national security of the state? Why is this the one thing they all seem to agree on? Not too long ago, passports weren't even required to cross national borders. It wasn't until the wake of World War I that the short-lived League of Nations even introduced standardized passport control. Yet, we barely ever stop to question why we need passports, or how the world got sorted into distinct territorial states. We kind of just accept that states have borders, and don't think much about the massive infrastructures of policing and violence needed to enforce them. It's hard to even think about a world without borders, unless we're John Lennon. Indeed, the state management of populations has become so embedded into the organization of social life that the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe was able to sardonically imitate European policymakers. He says, "We must close the borders, filter those who make it across them, process them, choose who we want to remain, deport the rest." Mbembe sums up what he calls the necropolitical border regime. Now, necropolitics is Mbembe's expansion on Foucault's concept of biopolitics, which, in the most simple terms possible, is the idea that politics is largely about the management of bodies. I'm not sure if this is true, but I think we did a video for Christmas a few years ago on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer that was about Foucault and biopolitics. So if you want to know more, watch the video on Rudolph. For Mbembe, necropolitics includes another government responsibility: excluding certain populations and consigning them to conditions closer to death. His description of Europe could be an ad for Fortress Europe. Or take the United States' own border, a violent security infrastructure which filters in specific migrant populations who may be useful to the global north, while excluding those deemed surplus, resigning them to places where death is maybe waiting for them. Just think about the cages and prisons holding immigrants on the US southern border, or the estimated 47,000 migrants being held in camps around Europe as of 2019. For Mbembe, this process makes the border a central tool for recreating racial divisions in the global north. Several scholars, including David Harvey, Wendy Brown, and Wolfgang Streck, have argued that racial logic within neoliberal states is not a necessary feature of neoliberal logic, but a vestige of older racist regimes. They argue that hostility to immigration and the persistence of racist border politics, camps, and prisons is counter to the neoliberal drive to open borders and allow the flow of free labor for ready exploitation. Viewed this way, the irrational shadow of long-standing racism is preventing the UK and Europe from, maybe solving their labor shortages. However, scholar Arun Kunani points out that while neoliberalism is obsessed with a kind of economic rationality, it also contains other multitudes, like racism. For example, early theorist of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, insisted that market logic isn't just the best way to organize society, but is the direct product of the Anglo-Saxon West's superior cultural evolution. If that was true, wouldn't the food be better? Hayek argues that this advanced European culture must be protected from barbarian outside forces, which would undermine its superiority. Like Mbembe, Kunani argues that under neoliberalism, race is a tool used to selectively include and exclude populations depending on how exploitable they are. It's a means of organizing the division of labor between the global north and global south, allowing powerful northern capital to selectively filter cheapened, precarious, super exploitable laborers. Like US agriculture, which allows precarious employment to a select group of immigrants under punishing conditions with little ability to collectively organize, lest they risk deportation. So rather than being in contradiction with neoliberalism, hard borders, anti-immigrant policies, and inflammatory rhetoric can be essential features. Now, this system protects the integrity of the Anglo-Saxon market society from non-Western outsiders, and allows local capital to cut labor costs thanks to racialized immigration status. Now, if border control was loosened and migrants were suddenly able to claim rights and protections, then both features would be compromised. Racializing borders is essential to organizing exploitable labor, which is necessary for the construction of the neoliberal state. Neoliberal state just meaning places like the United States, England, France, Germany, all those type places where our culture involves a lot of, global businesses, Starbucks, Burger King, capitalism, things of that nature. We also love war, so that's there too. Now, precarious immigration doesn't only recreate racial divisions, it also maintains patriarchy. Scholars David McNally and Sue Ferguson point out that U.S. immigration policy since NAFTA has simultaneously criminalized border crossings while hiring ever more illegal immigrant labor.
And if passed, the Senate bill, as currently written and is hitting the floor, would put in place the toughest border enforcement plan that America has ever seen.
A core drive of capitalism is to reduce the cost of labor by lowering the cost of its reproduction. One way to do that is through unwaged care work in the household, stuff like cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Widely known to be feminized, this work is devalued and disproportionately shouldered by women. But crucially, as neoliberalism has become entrenched around the world, the global north has increasingly used the racializing border system to exploit migrant women into providing cheap reproductive labor. As women in the global north are expected both to work and be carers in the home, they've been encouraged in different ways to outsource household reproductive labor to migrant women. For example, Canada's Live-In Care Worker Program, or LCP, was used to plug the hole in childcare left by insufficient state funding. It relied on women from the global south hired for dirt cheap wages. Now, unsurprisingly, these unprotected workers have experienced immense exploitation and some abuse, with some forced to work 12-hour days without breaks. From the UK to Spain to Sweden, there's been a sharp increase in migrant women providing cheap domestic labor disproportionately for white women. Now, we see the same in the US. This labor is precarious. Workers lack access to healthcare and bargaining power. Here, the very presence of the border makes the task of reproducing and raising lots of little future workers cheaper. You ever think about that? That all the stuff in our culture, right? It's like, oh, have children. Having kids is so important. You don't want to be a childless cat lady, have kids. Well, why do they want you to have kids so much, To create a workforce. That's it. They don't care about T-ball, art class, anything else. They just want you to make a little worker with their little hands for the mines and all the factory equipment or the computer. Sometimes my daughter looks at me when I'm on the laptop and I'm just like, this is the little work box. One day, everything, you just do this all day, you do this, and you create things. And do they matter? I don't really know, but then sometimes you get to go to the doctor because of it. Exciting times. That such labor is both feminized and racialized further cements both patriarchal and racial divisions in Western societies. When middle-class women export reproductive labor to underpaid migrant women, it then devalues that labor. And it reinforces the idea that the responsibility for such labor ought to lie with women and people of color, upholding both oppressive hierarchies. So when neoliberal politicians pursue anti-immigration policy and rhetoric, it's not necessarily an irrational contradiction. Rather, it's an expression of an underlying goal to separate populations to protect the cultural superiority of market states while selectively allowing the flow of racialized, low-cost labor. You put it this way, neoliberalism begins to look, a little bit authoritarian. I might even say if I was pushed, a little bit fascist, just a little fascist. So fascism is notoriously difficult to define. For political scientist Anthony R. DiMaggio, features of fascism crucially include authoritarian state practices, white supremacy and nationalism, and patriarchal authoritarian politics. Now let's go in order to see if the neoliberal border regime qualifies. If you want to play a game, let me know in the comments before we do this if you think it's going to qualify or not, with a yes, a no, or an of course. Okay, firstly, the neoliberal border regime demands authoritarian control. They require huge policing infrastructure to maintain, including prisons on the southern border, or the investment in an MI5-style border force planned by the Labor government. What's more, the increased outsourcing of such infrastructure to private corporations since the 80s, which has especially escalated since COVID, means this infrastructure is frequently distanced from direct democratic oversight. It also means some select private companies are raking in a fortune worth of tax dollars for the work of imprisoning migrants seeking asylum.
That you wished you had not done work for ICE.
Absolutely. Completely.
You wish you'd never done it.
No. You asked, is there ever a time?
Now, for scholar Ian Bruff, the increased separation of state activities from democratic oversight is essential to what he calls authoritarian neoliberalism. He cites neoliberal thinkers' long-standing suspicion of the masses as the reason state responsibilities have increasingly been outsourced to unelected technocrats and private corporations. Now, border politics may be a wedge through which further authoritarian transformations of the state occur, edging us closer and closer to overt fascism. That's right, edging is fascist. Now, second on our features of fascist politics is white supremacy and extreme nationalism. As we've seen, both neoliberal politicians and the far right have peddled extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric. Dividing and managing populations through the racializing structure of the border reinforces the integrity of the sacred national entity in the white imaginary. As Mbembe points out, migrants in the imagination of Western states are merely a kind of hollowed-out entity, walking vaults concealed by a multitude of organs, empty yet menacing forms in which we seek to bury the fantasies of an age terrified of itself and of its own excess. The global North's history of white supremacy is cemented through strong border regimes. When Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer invoke the supposed threat of immigration, they're functionally using the same political framework as the fascist who set fire to a hotel containing migrant families. When it comes to immigration, the line between fascist and neoliberal politics starts to look awfully blurry.
They're not going to come in and just immediately go and collect welfare.
A border security bill that would have put 1,500 more agents on the border.
Now, finally, we get DiMaggio's last criteria. Fascism invokes authoritarian patriarchy, the reinforcement of traditional social roles for women, especially reproductive caring labor. Feminist scholars like Wendy Brown and Melinda Cooper point out that the reinscription of traditional gender roles for women is an essential aspect of neoliberal thought. A good example is America's welfare system, as it has been transformed to ensure that social reproductive duties are shouldered by women within a patriarchal household. As we've seen at the border, neoliberal policies reproduce these exact same ideas along both racial and gendered lines. So we can see that border policies are both produced by a deeply patriarchal neoliberalism and are essential in perpetuating it. And these immigration policies may be reinforcing the racial and patriarchal conditions in which fascism can thrive. Now, the choice facing us may not be between fascism and no fascism, but between fully or only partly realizing it. In other words, it's like, do you want fascism? There's like diet fascism, like angry military fascism, or like cool girl boss fascism, like I have a gun and I'm at your house fascism, and like, oh my God, Coldplay did this cool new song fascism. And somehow it only gets worse because the proliferating border security apparatus is increasingly going to be used against the massive populations who will be displaced by global warming. Now, this is already happening as the changing climate is causing living conditions to become more difficult, especially for populations in the global south. But increasingly, folks desperately fleeing to the global north won't be seeking economic opportunity or asylum from oppressive regimes. They'll be climate refugees simply trying to survive a warming planet. Despite the fact that the vast majority of historic emissions and the entire mode of production cooking us alive all came from the global north. And it's all too easy to imagine that our governments will react to this inevitable displacement by intensifying the cruelty and severity of an already horrific border regime. As Dakshayani Surakumaran and Brahmi Yagan argue, echoing Mbembe and Kunani, as the climate emergency worsens, the border, as a tool of social sorting, will be used by governments and corporations to categorize populations into those who can be sacrificed and those who must be protected as economies start to fail and resources become scarce. Now, viewed this way, the false dichotomy of right-wing versus left authoritarianism versus liberalism all start to feel like two sides of the same coin. What then of the upcoming election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris here in America? If both are advocating for immigration and border policies that exemplify this inherently racist logic is a slow slide into fascism, a little bit inevitable. Okay, on that happy note, let me know what you all think. I want to give a huge shout out to this video's writer, John Duncan. It's his first script with us. He also has his own very, very good YouTube channel. We'll drop a link in the description, so please do go subscribe and check that out. Huge thanks to all of our patrons as well. Thank you so, so much. If you want to help our channel stay alive while getting videos early with no ads and extra content, click the link in the description. Go check it out. And even if you don't do that, that's okay. Thanks for being here. And please do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you don't already, leave a question or a comment, even if it's ridiculous. It all helps us a lot. In the meantime, remember, there's no border to my heart, and you're welcome whenever you want, with or without a passport. I'll see you there.